Hi, my name is Gabriel Sardo, and I chose the podcast with Wendell Berry and Ellen Davis on the art of being creatures. And kind of to start off with, it was a very difficult read for me in listening to the podcast. I'm not very well versed in this topic, and I didn't really understand a lot of what was going on and spoken about. It took me multiple replays of the audio and in-depth looking in the article about like what was going on and what they were really talking about. There was a lot of depth in this from Ellen Davis. So kind of the first thing she talked about was land, how there was a lot of talk about land in the Bible. And at first she didn't realize this, but then one of her colleagues or scholars talked to her about it, and she was like, okay, I'm gonna start looking for it in the Bible more and more. And as she looked, she realized it was pretty easy to find the more she was looking for it. So, and it was a lot more about the perspective of land and not really just the talk of land. So as she lectured to her students about this, it started to make more and more sense to her. And it wasn't just only that she was looking at the Bible and trying to find pictures of land. She was also comparing it to California and how because that was her hometown. She grew up in California. She started comparing the land talked about in the Bible to her hometown and started making connections, finding what was similar, what was different compared to how she was. So I think that's one important thing when you try to read the Bible. You have to try to make connections to your own life and so it helps you understand like what's going on better. So the second thing they talked about was the eating and how the 7 days that God created. So kind of one thing that really resonated with me was the Peru Evru, which was a be fruitful and multiply, which God talked about the creatures of the earth. So kind of the way they explained it was from the book of Genesis. How they explained it was that the humans, they have the skilled mastery, and that the skilled mastery is to grow and develop, and they are to eat the creatures, but also like the creatures have to be fruitful and multiply, but the humans have to also are like God told them they're able to eat all the creatures that are there. So kind of that, it didn't really make sense to me. How are you giving one set of instructions, God is, I guess, of the creatures to be fruitful, multiply, and grow, and you're telling a different set of group who's, I guess, because they have the skilled mastery of the humans, almost, I guess, superior, God is saying to these people. So he's saying, while they're doing this, you can eat them, do whatever you want to them, which that didn't really make a lot of sense to me on why would God say, do this to one, and then he said, oh, you're better, so you can do whatever you want to them. It didn't really make a lot of sense to me. But so when the book of Genesis, Ellen saw the eating as practical theology, and how eating is honoring God with our bodies, which again didn't really make sense to me in this regard of killing and eating is honoring God. That didn't really resonate with me, but she read the book obviously, and I haven't, so that's how she saw it. But no, the way she compared the book of Genesis to a poem, and talked about how poems are detailed, precise, and realistic. And how to read poems, you have to read it. You cannot be distracted by anything. There's a lot of deep meanings, and you have to really look into it. You can't be distracted by anything, which she explained that you have to do this with the book of Genesis. You can't skim it. You have to slow down to understand it. You can't skim it, obviously, and you have to really dive in and look deep into what is going on in the book of Genesis and the Bible. So that's one way. Another way of how you should be reading it, you should be undivided attention when reading it. Do not watch Netflix while trying to read anything, but you have to, when you're reading the book of the Bible, you have to be focused and looking for things that aren't explicitly said. You have to dive deeper. So the third thing she talked about was the reading of the scripture is to bring us back to the immediate presence of God. So when reading things, she says that you should like when you're reading, you should feel closer to God, which in my personal opinion, not just, I don't, when I'm reading something like religious, I don't personally feel closer to God. I disagree with her in that regard, but I could also understand and see how when reading something religious or a sacred text, you can feel closer to him and feel like he is next to you in that regard. So one of the things she said that really kind of summarized everything, got like really resonated with me the most, was if you read carefully the Bible, you rethink everything you took for granted. And she said this specifically. She said you have to look how the text challenges your way of thinking to a new one. So you kind of, I really like this quote because this is kind of how I think also, like, you should be reading this stuff. Like, when I read it, I was like, wow, she's right. You should definitely do this when reading books that you don't understand. Like, you have to rethink. You can't think in your own regard. You have to have an outside the box thing. You can't just be narrow placed in how you're thinking. You can't, when you're reading the book of the Bible, you can't just think about your own religion, what's your own thinking, and think, oh, the book's either saying, yeah, the book's saying, yes, that I'm exactly right. It's not really that type of book to read. You have to look at how it's also saying you're right, but it's also saying how you are wrong. And you have to, it's hard to do, but you have to have that open mindset and figure out that not everything you say is right, and how the book of the Bible, the book of Genesis, they are obviously telling you things when you're looking deeply into it, but you can't say you're always right, or this book's right, this book's wrong. You have to have an open mind and find the right and the wrong and take it with you. And and Ellen had a very dominant and subdued view of the Bible in the book of Genesis, how it was very tough, and that's what she talks about in the fourth little part of the podcast. Sorry. So she talked about how the prophet books, they're full of despair when you read them, and how when she read them with her classes, they were all in depression in the beginning, and like how they were all like, she could sense that they're all like depressed together. Like it's not a happy reading in the beginning. It's a very sad, and you're feeling very down. It's not happy. And she talked about how some of her students would cry, like some of the students were crying, and how people should cry when they're reading these books, which that's an interesting take. But she said also towards the end of all these books, there was this almost brightness and happiness that is surrounded by everyone reading. Like, from what I understood, it was like a fairy tale ending almost to the books. Like, everything was happy, everything was understood. But she also said that when you end these books, you feel like you have a better relationship with God and humanity. As humans, you feel closer to God, and like all these books ended with God and humans reaching a good relationship again. Which, I haven't read these books, I don't know what they're talking about with this, but I feel like that's something you should be looking for then when you're reading all these books about the Bible and sacred texts. You should be looking for the ending that you feel closer to God then, and look for how humanity and God then came together towards the end of these texts. That's another thing you should be looking for. And then the last thing she said, which I 100% agree with, was she said, to see hope, see the problem. To see hope, you have to see the problem. Which what I understood that as is to see the brightness and the happiness of these books and how it can enlighten you and make you enlightened, feel closer to God, have that close relationship. You have to see the problems that the people made in the books, and see the problem that people made in the book of Genesis, the Bible, and all the prophet books. But you also, I think the reason why they're saying these problems in the book is so that people nowadays, they don't make these same mistakes. So I think though that's very important to take. Like, you shouldn't just be reading it and thinking, oh yeah, these people did this 2,000, 3,000 years ago. Don't worry about it. 2,000, 3,000 years. You gotta like look at and try to like, again, what you said in the first thing, you have to compare it to today, and you see the problem they're making, but it's not gonna be the exact problem because we don't live in the exact same day and age. But you gotta compare it to today's problems and find the relationship and see what's similar, and then realize, oh, this way back when is similar to this in today's day and age, and be like, okay, so, and then in the Bible they talked about how that was bad, so this obviously should be bad. So I think that's another way you got to look at it. And yeah, no, last thing, so the Bible reader Wendell Perry, I think it was, I didn't understand that very well. Like, I understood like transcripts, what the interviewer was saying. It was very, very, she explained things very well. I couldn't understand it. The poems, I didn't understand or really get the topic of how it was related to what Ellen was saying the whole time, or what they were talking about in the interview. I feel like almost the poems might have taken away a bit from the interview. Like I tried to I listened to them like 2 or 3 times, and I just almost like view to see what they were saying, but I couldn't find the similarities to what they were talking about in the podcast to what the poems were talking about between the sections. So that was very confusing and abnormal to me. So yeah, to summarize, I guess, the way we should be looking at and trying to read the Bible is trying to look for deeper meanings, have an open mind, and not have like your own mindset. Like, have an open mind. There's multiple views of how to read it. You got to have that. And when you're reading the Bible, if you read something and you realize you're wrong, you can't just be like, oh, it's wrong, whatever. You got to understand and be like, oh yeah, okay, maybe I'm wrong. And you got to accept that. And you got to find the deeper meanings and try to compare to today's day and age, and not just look at how it was way back when and try to just say, oh, back then. You got to make connections, deeper thinking, read the stories, and just don't be unfocused. You have to be very focused when reading these books. That's kind of the message that Ellen kind of told me throughout the whole thing. So yeah, that's my summary of kind of what was going on.